Welcome to Cooper and Cary Have Words. It's great to be back with you. And my name is James Cary. I'm the Cary half. And again, frustratingly close, but not present, is Barry Cooper over there in Epsom. Hello to you, Barry.
Hello, James. Lovely to see you. And good to be in England.
It is. It is good to be in England. And absurdly close to you, over in Leatherhead, is the pastor of Grace Church, called John Herring. Hello, John.
Hello.
We're thrilled that you're able to join us because we're going to talk about jazz. And just to fill people in very quickly, John used to be an secondary school teacher. Was it a music teacher?
It was music, yeah.
You studied music at the University of Southampton and then have ended up in the ministry, but have also used music, in particular jazz, which is what we're going to be talking about today, as an evangelistic tool. But one of our bugbears, as listeners will know, is, does art always have to be evangelistically useful? What about art for art's sake? Hans Ruckmacher would say, in his very strong accent, art needs no justification. But we'll get on to that.
Where's he from?
I don't know, but I think he's Dutch or something.
He's Dutch.
But I heard a talk from him, which was quite hard because it was also recorded on a cassette. It wasn't great.
Yeah.
But he kind of came over that. So, John, why don't you just tell us about how you got into music, what that looks like for you, and how you've pivoted towards jazz within that?
Yeah, great. So I grew up in a house where my dad was a music teacher, so I followed his footsteps. He taught me piano from a young age, but what I really wanted to do after hearing Phil Collins was play drums. So
was it a particular
drums,
Phil Collins track or album that did it?
But seriously, I think,
yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Great album.
Yeah.
I think it's embarrassing to admit you're a fan of Phil Collins these days, isn't it?
No, I think it's come out the other side. I think you're all right
Has
now.
it?
Yeah, 5 years ago, not so cool. Now you're good.
Okay.
That's right. Gated reverb for the win.
Today.
Sorry.
Yes. Say two late 40s men. No, Phil Collins is fine. It's fine. Everyone says Phil Collins is fine.
Yeah, it's fine again.
Yeah.
Drums became my favourite instrument, but so grew up playing loads of music, and actually my drum teacher was a famous jazz vibes player, which is fairly niche, but he played with Ronnie Verrill, who was the drummer he recorded the drums for the Muppets.
Whoa, okay, now you're talking our language.
No.
Yeah. So I met him a couple of times. Absolutely fascinating man. Walked with a hunch. He must have been in his late 70s when I met him, and he used to drive a sports car, rock up to these gigs and kind of get out of this sports car in this hunch position and then just remain in that hunch position for the rest of the evening. But I had the privilege of actually playing alongside him, which was very inspiring. So I think I've played regularly in a jazz orchestra run by this guy called Roger Nobes, jazz vibe player, and that was really where my passion for jazz came. I was, first of all, I was the percussionist and sat behind a drummer who was a few years older than me and learnt everything I knew from him. Went to university and carried that on, really. Right.
So jazz in particular was always your preferred, was it?
So the thing about jazz, and as that's what we're talking about, is it's kind of the pinnacle of performance for, I guess, contemporary music performers. So particularly for drummers, if you want to test yourself, if you want to really explore your instrument, jazz is kind of where you go.
And that's because of the inherently improvisational quality of it, or?
Yeah, improvisation, and just it's one of those art forms where you're trying to explore, you're seeking to impress, and so you're seeking to kind of push the boundaries, and as a drummer technically it pushes you. So
and also you get a solo. I'm thinking, I listen to a lot of jazz quintet kind of stuff, or particularly I used to anyway. I still do a bit, but you might easily get a quite long drum solo where you're going to have to pull something out of thin air, and the keyboards pull back, the saxophonist stops for a bit, and it's all over to you and the bass, and then the bass gets their own solo as well. I've never liked bass solos.
If I could just
bass solos.
If I could just bring things full circle, I went to a Genesis concert in 1986 where Phil Collins played a 10-minute drum solo. I had never experienced such a thing before. I'm not sure I want to again, but it was great to have that in the context of a rock concert. It was quite unexpected.
Yeah.
Yeah, the drum solo is the drum. So bass solos are the butt of all jazz jokes. Drum solos are the kind of most egotistical and long-winded solos you get. But they and the thing about jazz is you just never know when the band leader might turn to you and go drum solo. So you're always on the seat of your pants and ready for it.
I feel like for the second episode in a row, I'm going to get to do a Spinal Tap jingle. Because
I love that,
we're talking about drummers. He died in a bizarre gardening accident. Police said, best left unsolved. Just like, because the police say that. That's a thing, isn't it? But anyway, sorry. That's what drummers are now making me think of. So why don't you talk a bit about... So actually, reset. For me, my gateway into jazz was initially Charlie Brown. So I used to love watching Charlie Brown. It was on the TV in the UK, and it was a mix of the tone of the show, but also the music. And the music was just like, I want all music to be like this. This is amazing, and you just wouldn't hear it anywhere else because it was such a specific vibe and tone.
How did it make you feel, James?
Unbelievably cool for a start.
Yeah, right.
But weirdly not cool because everybody, when you're 15, hates jazz. And meanwhile at school, so I learned the trumpet and then played in a big band at school, which was really cool. But it was never quite as cool as the music that I wanted to play, which was sort of veering into that Horace Silver, Bill Evans jazz quintet stuff. And I wish I'd learnt the piano, really, rather than the trumpet. I'm not really a jazz trumpet fan so much. But also, bear in mind, when I was about 15, the year was about 1989, 1990. They were not good years for pop music. And so, when Europe, the Final Countdown, is in the charts, it's
Lisa
pretty slim.
It's not great.
It's pretty slim picking. So I used to tape Radio 2's Big Band special off the radio and listen to that all week until the next one. And so for me, jazz, and actually still now I listen to jazz. The latest, when Apple got the latest Snoopy in Space series, the actual animation, the comedy, as it were, I think it's really average at best. It's very preachy and expositional. But there's a couple of tracks on that which are so transcendently, wonderfully, beautifully fantastic. I can't stop listening to them. And for me, there's just something about the music which is as close as to I get to being really emotional. And I'm not a particularly emotional person. And I don't really know why that is. And it's partly because... And it's puzzled me for a long time. And it's because, well, how can I get so emotional about it? There aren't any words telling me what to think, telling me what the song is about, which is, of course, partly where some of the roots of jazz come from, isn't it? So maybe why don't we get into that roots of jazz stuff, and then maybe we can look at when jazz takes on a life of its own and doesn't require singing lyrics. Where did jazz come from originally?
Yeah, so that's something that I've got quite into, and have got a little event called the Roots of Jazz, because interestingly, it's rooted in the gospel. So obviously, it's related to blues music. Blues music would be secular. It was based on the woes and struggles of those caught up in the slave trade. Singing first work songs as they were in the field and expressing their emotions about the situation they found themselves in. That was the root of blues music. But amazingly, in the sort of great revival that happened around the same time, many of them were hearing the gospel, were taken along either to their white slave owners' church or went along to things called hush harbours or these praise events where they would go along and hear the gospel, and as they heard the gospel, it completely reshaped the tone of their music, of course, because now they had a joy and a hope through that suffering. That is the roots of jazz in a nutshell, I guess. And just absolutely fascinated by that, both as a lover of jazz and a lover of Jesus.
It's really interesting how you talk about those Christian roots as well, because I guess we always start history slightly late. And so looking back, you think, well, the black roots of jazz would obviously mean that it has a religious background, it has a Christian background, but you think there's nothing inherently Christian about formerly African slaves. Africa wasn't a hotbed of Christianity. So at some point there was a sense in which there was a revival amongst the slave population of the US, and we just tend to assume it was inevitable. But actually, the more you think about it, the more incredibly counterculturally surprising it is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's entirely and highly unlikely that those who are being oppressed by these white Christians would turn to the gospel. But I guess reveals the miracle of the work of the Spirit, doesn't it? Yeah. That even in that, they could find hope in Christ.
And that in itself is a gospel message, isn't it? Because obviously, Christianity has some roots in slavery itself when it talks about going back to Egypt. And I think you pick up on one or two of those things in the Roots of Jazz show, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that was, they found an affinity with the Israelites themselves and the story of the Exodus. And many of those early gospel spirituals are around the story of the Exodus, or, finding themselves in a new foreign land in the wilderness and that sort of thing. So they found their own story in the story of the Bible, and we're able to relate to that in a deeper level than I guess most of us can.
So why don't
which is fascinating.
So why don't Christians like jazz then, John?
Well, you were saying, we were talking before, you said they kind of do as background music.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Yeah, I think Christians have a strange affinity for jazz in that. I remember as a new young Christian at the CU that. Knowing that I played jazz, I was often asked to get a band together to play at an evangelistic event, which I always found a bit strange, but I didn't mind as long as I was getting the opportunity to play some jazz. So we would have a little band in the corner, and somehow the gospel would be sledgehammered into that event. And
I don't know what you're talking about.
And that continued into my early years in churches. And that was why I sort of this event, the Roots of Jazz, came about, because I just wasn't happy with that. I wasn't happy with just being a band in the background with the gospel being sledgehammered in through a testimony or something. Yeah,
when the actual roots of what you're playing is fundamentally Christian and about liberation and freedom from slavery in a spiritual sense to sin.
Yeah, exactly. And so just to say, Bill Edgar had done a lot of work on that, and I heard some of what he'd done, and he was a huge inspiration for then me going away and doing a lot more work on that, and that's where the event, the Roots of Jazz, came from.
The thing is, we don't really seem to mind borrowing musical genre in the church from places which are transparently completely secular. Given that most bands currently sound like basically a sort of a version of like 70s or 80s soft rock that's been slightly upgraded towards Coldplay or U2 or something. It's got that vague stadium rock. It always makes me laugh, actually, when you've got like a worship leader who's clearly modelled himself on that, and those sorts of sounds are basically modelled for a stadium, and you are in a room that's literally got about, 80 people in it, and there's that kind of tone of voice that they get, which sounds like, and now we're going to sing this and that, and you're like, mate, you're not talking to 4,000 people. It's just these people. So
with our lighters in the air.
Yeah, but all of that to say, it's interesting that we don't seem to have any problem there with, as it were, borrowing from secular music. So even if jazz didn't have demonstrably Christian origins, it still throws up the question, well, why is it that we don't see more services maybe that perhaps use that style, or just more Christians who seem to embrace it? Do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, I think if you went to the Pentecostal church, you would you would see a lot more influence of jazz music in their style. And oh boy, I wish we had that in my church. But yeah, I mean, it is rooted in the history of African American people and in black culture, and so where I think you might find yourself in a more a church that is more highly populated by black people, you would see more influences of jazz harmonies, and therefore sort of the gospel music of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then 90s, sort of the Kirk Franklins and stuff like that. I'd love it. I would love that if that were in my church. I'm training up my son at the moment. He's listening to Kirk Franklin day and night, and is learning those harmonies, training him up for a future of leading some better music in our church.
And just for those, I'm genuinely curious about this. How would you describe the kind of style of jazz that you like to play best? I mean, is it more... I don't even know if these terms are completely redundant now, but sort of traditional, modern, like what? How would you bracket it, or is that a very ugly question to ask?
No, it's not an ugly question. No, so jazz is
an ignorant question, but it's but it's a good one. Give me some words to say to describe so that I can now ask this question.
If you've never heard Cooper and Cary have words before, this is how we.
Yeah, this is all normal.
No. Jazz is very broad. I would probably be a fairly tame jazzer. I like playing most styles. The good thing about the broadness of it is that there are many different styles to explore, and they are sort of united in many ways. But yeah, you've got the original there's ragtime would kind of be early, and then your trad jazz as well from those sort of beginning of the 20th century, and then it morphed into several different styles. So as it moved out of New Orleans and into Chicago and New York, it became a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more organized, but then a little bit that experimental side of jazz continued, and that's when you get the sort of 60s and 70s, the Miles Davis, the Coltrane's pushing the boundaries in different ways, approaching sort of modal jazz and bebop and those sort of things. And those are great to play as well. I love that style of music. It's continues to be creative and based around improvisation, so it's still a lot of fun to play. And then you get into the more contemporary jazz that is just a little bit out there, and you've got to be probably smoking something to really enjoy it.
Plenty of incense in the service for that one. What?
yeah.
So I was going to ask you about that. Do you think it's I want to say, Jonathan, there's bits in the Bible about God being a God of order and not of chaos, of peace and harmony, and not chaos and disorder. So what business have we got with, dealing with musical genres which are all about kind of tearing up the rule books, and at least to the uninitiated like me, yes, I know. It can sometimes sound sort of quite, like a cacophonous noise. Some people might say. And
it makes people angry. Jazz genuinely can make people properly furious.
And do you think? I mean, how should we be rightly thinking about these things as Christian people?
Yeah, there's a few things in there to jump off of, but I guess firstly the ordered nature of it. There's something about jazz that is both disordered and ordered. So there are structures within jazz. There are things about jazz that when you come together as a group, you know what's going to happen even before it's happened. You get to the end of a tune and you just know it's going to go da 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 boom. You just feel that, and
that's one of my favorites.
And you roll with that.
That one.
Yeah, it's a great ending. There's the 12-bar blues. There's rhythm changes. There's all these different orders to jazz, but within that, there's also the opportunity to explore and create. And so, I guess the answer to your question, how do we respond to that as Christians and see the goodness in that? We are, as with art and as you've discussed before on your podcast, we are creative beings. We're made in the image of God who likes to create. A God who created something from nothing, and in jazz, that's exactly what you're sort of doing. Although at the same time, there are rules and order beneath that there are harmonies that you've learnt, there are chord changes you've learnt, there are scales and modes that you've learnt that fit or don't fit, and sometimes you want a bit of both of that because you want a slight dissonance that's going to resolve. And there's so much in there that reflects, I think. I
think that's so important. I think the orderliness of jazz is beautiful, and we've talked before about the oughtness of endings with regard to story, but there's an oughtness to music as well. And actually, I would say truly chaotic music is the Romance classical music, where you have a symphony which you don't really know where it's going. It's like a story that is unpredictable, whereas music, jazz, which is fundamentally also from ragtime, really, isn't it? That feels like the J.S. Bach of jazz is Scott Joplin, and you've got the theme and the variations, you've got the key changes and stuff. And so whenever a jazz track is sort of riffing in some direction, we know it's going to land at some point. It's going to resolve itself. And I think we see that in the Bible as well. I think I've really been thinking a lot about the story of the Bible and the stories, and they just go round and round and round in slightly bigger loops and with variations. So, for example, God's appearances at wells in Genesis and at springs. So you get Jacob at a well, you get Isaac meeting his wife at a well, so on his behalf. He's not there, and then you get Hagar, who is cast out. She is also at a well, and then later on you get Jesus with the Samaritan woman at a well. And so there are just all of these cycles within Scripture of a theme that's been established and is repeated, but in a modified form. And in a way, the modification is the interesting bit. Otherwise, it's just flat repetition. And to some extent, nobody wants that. And so if we, as God's image bearers, are recreators in his image, we're going to take his patterns and make them ever more complex. But fundamentally, they're still going to be using the same order. And then and then occasionally it just sort of feels like it's really become disconnected from the order, and that's when it really starts to sound hard. If you're really experienced on this stuff, you sort of know that it's going to end in a sort of a pleasing way. But then sometimes it doesn't, and that's what makes it interesting. And that's when I guess the visual equivalent is anti-art, which is, here you go, pile of bricks on the ground. Is that art? To which the answer is, well, not really, but thanks for asking the question.
But isn't there a jazz equivalent of the pile of bricks?
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like, as a believer, should we embrace that and say, actually, no, this says something really important about, I don't know, dissonance or something in a world without God, which is the standard sort of modern justification for everything that's in there? Or do we say, actually, do you know what? We're people of hope. We do believe in an ultimate resolution, and therefore we're looking to explore musical genres where we can actually demonstrate that, or subgenres. Do you know what I mean? Or am I?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of music, the best music comes out of mistakes as well. And I think that's what jazz shows you all the way through, that all these different genres that come out of it, they often say that there's no wrong notes in jazz. Not entirely true, but the best things come out of mistakes. My son, as I was saying, is getting into music quite considerably. He's doing his GCSE composition at the moment, and I was listening to it, and I said, I love that bit. And he said, I played that chord by accident, but I liked it, so I kept it in. And that's that often, the more you explore, improvise, it's when you do that, when you're creating, often it's through your mistakes that you find, I like the sound of that. Let's riff with that, see where it takes us. Just another thing about, as you were saying, the sort of repeated patterns found in Scripture, I guess it's worth saying for those who don't know much about jazz, what you get in jazz is you get the tune, you get the theme, what's called the head, which you'll play once or twice, and then you're left to then improvise, and you'll go, but you're still going round that same head, that same chord sequence, but you're creating new melodic ideas, you're riffing off the theme, you're creating your own theme. That's kind of how jazz works. And what's interesting is, we've been doing this event, The Roots of Jazz, for I think about 7 or 8 years. We play the same tunes every time, but we're not bored of it because actually each time it sounds different, because each time someone will improvise differently, or we'll have a new member of the band will come in and play with us, or someone will take it a slightly different direction.
And also, you're just in a different room. It's just like it's a Thursday, and it just sounds different because it's a Thursday.
Yeah.
Or here's the weird one. It's a full moon. I don't know if it's a thing within live music performance, but within comedy, audiences are weird on full moons. That's just any experienced stand-up comedian will say, yeah, I don't understand it either, but there's definitely something in it. Full moons, audiences are weird. Sidebar, one for another time.
Yeah. Well, the kind of the repeating refrain thing is interesting. I was saying to you guys just before we started recording that the two albums that I bought on CD, because I kept seeing them listed as some of the greatest albums ever made in this genre, and I thought I really need to understand this. So I bought A Love Supreme by John Coltrane and Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. And there's that wonderful thing. I mean, I didn't get it at the time, but having subsequently sort of listened to it a lot more and read about it, there is that wonderful thing at the end of the first movement, I think it is, of A Love Supreme, where you have the four notes, A Love Supreme, A Love Supreme, and he does it in 12 different keys at the end. So he does all the different keys. So again, that speaks to the variation thing that you were talking about. The idea being, and it is quite a cerebral thing, that he's communicating wherever you look, that love supreme exists. You can't go anywhere to escape a love supreme. God's love is everywhere, in everything. And he obviously made it as a very self-consciously spiritual piece of work, which is probably why people like Philip Larkin really hated it, because as a dyed-in-the-wool sort of atheist, he wasn't keen on that sort of thing, found it a bit pompous. But yeah, the idea that jazz is this sort of slightly, there's no wrong notes kind of idea. The more you read about it, the more you think there's a deep order here that the best practitioners are adhering to and thinking of, even in the variation.
Yeah, so we, as I say, we perform quite regularly as a group, but often we're short of saxophonists. So someone will phone up a friend, we need a saxophonist next week, could you come and play? And we'll not have time to rehearse, and they'll just slot in because they know the patterns, they know the routine. And when I second half, I'll often say, oh, this is the first time we've played with so and so, and the audience are dumbfounded, can't understand. And how long did you rehearse? 10 minutes before the show. Jazz is like that. In fact, the first time we ever did the Roots of Jazz, I think I said to you guys, I had come up with this idea. I'd sent out the charts. Here's the songs I want to do. Here's a rough idea of where I want to take them. It'd be great if we can get it together at 5:00. Event starts at 7:30. We'll have a couple of hours to rehearse, and we can rest before the performance. And the saxophonist, the last member of the band, rocked up at 7 p.m. And it was a fly by the seat of your pants event, which jazz is at its best when it's like that. And I think that was probably the best one we've ever done, just because it was raw. That's how jazz should be, and it worked. And we kept doing it ever since.
Do you think audiences are more forgiving because they know it's improvisational? A little bit like with comedy. Do you think that that's a thing or not?
I think definitely, yeah. But I think also jazz is one of those musics where the people playing it are enjoying it a lot more than the audience quite often. But in a way, that's not a bad thing, because that is contagious. And I've got one of our players, Andre Brown. He's an amazing saxophonist. And when he's on our gig, it's just phenomenal because he lives it, he breathes it, and he just draws the crowd along with him. And I think that's the other thing to say about jazz is it is storytelling, and that's why I know you guys all. That's why I imagine James loves it, because jazz is storytelling, and you're telling a story as you improvise. Maybe you're telling your own story, maybe you're creating a story off the top of your head, but it is storytelling, and that is at the heart of jazz, partly because of where it came from. It's rooted in the gospel, but it is expressing a joy. And as Bill Edgar talks about when he talks about the roots of jazz, it's an expressing a joy that kind of is inexpressible in any other way, because it's come through sorrow, it's come through difficulty and hardship. It's true joy. It's not it's deeper than happiness. Happiness is kind of a shortcut. Joy is it's come through the other side of suffering, and so jazz it is a deep art form. And James was saying, that when he listens to it, he finds himself being more emotional than he might with other forms. And I think that's probably because that's the heart of it. It's telling a story, and you can relate to it.
Yeah, except the old conservative evangelical in me is going, what do you mean a story? What story is this? So
There's no words,
is it?
Are there?
Does a G represent a man, and is an F a dog? And so when it goes from G to F, it's like a man taking a dog for a walk. Is that? And then what does he do? Fall in a river? What's the story?
No, he plays a saxophone,
and yet,
doesn't he?
Put it like that. Obviously, it's idiotic, and I am parodying for effect and comedy, but that's my job. But there's just I just always want to push back against this notion that something should be. I don't get it. Stop. It's like no. If you don't get it, then keep listening. And it's a bit like the conversation we had with Ali Gordon about art recently. About when you go to a gallery, just have a look at the painting and just look, and what does it make you think of? And we're so obsessed with right and wrong answers. What is this painting meant to be saying to me? It's like, look, if it could be summed up in a sentence, then the artist should have just written a sentence and written a book or a poem.
Yeah, that's what David Lynch always says in interviews. What's the film about, David? And he's like, the film is the speaking.
Yeah,
you're like, that's the point. But the thing is that people don't have a problem with classical music. Those the same people you're talking about who would have an issue with jazz because there's no story wouldn't have an issue with something else instrumental like classical, right? Or would they?
Or the circuitous way in which the Bible is written.
Yeah.
So when Jesus says something or doesn't say something, and it's clearly a reference to something somewhere else, and that in itself is a reference to something that took place in Genesis chapter 7 or 3 or whatever, and we might be able to say, well, why didn't you just say that? It's like, well, but it wouldn't have been as good if I just said it, would it? Well, I think we would have all found it much more helpful. And so in a way, jazz is one of these things where it's just listen. And if you still don't like it, if you listen to it, then that's fine. But there's no point in being angry that you can't relate to it. In the same way that you can watch a football match or sport. One of my favourite lines from Fawlty Towers is when Major says to him, Hampshire won at cricket, and Fawlty says, oh, did it? Which is what you would never say, Tottenham won. Oh, did it? No. Sorry, did they? Did you? Did we? Not, wait, what? And so that just shows a complete tin ear for competitive sport that I just think in one tiny little word says so much. But again, the fact that it was expressed in that way is just itself just joyful, isn't it? It's just that one little moment. Anyway, rant briefly over, or at least paused.
Well, and it's interesting because Barry was asking, why do people hate jazz? And I think the problem is that so often it's probably because they've either just heard it in the elevator, or they've at Pizza Express or in the background somewhere. But when people come to our event, so often people come up afterwards and say, I didn't know it was going to be that good. And I mean, that's sounding a little bit arrogant. It's not me, it's the rest of it. But it is that kind of, jazz music live is something else. And I would encourage people to get to a live gig, because that storytelling element, you have to experience, you have to be there. And like I say, with this guy, Andre, when he plays, we've had some saxophonists who come along who are technically brilliant. They know all the scales to play. And, technically they're phenomenal, but they don't actually tell the story as they do it. You don't feel it as they play it. They've learnt the chops, they've learnt all the theory, but they don't feel it. Whereas Andre, when he plays, it's just oozing out from him, and he draws everyone along with him because he's telling that story.
There's something about being in the room. I mean, Barry, think back to your days when you trod the boards. I mean, there must have been moments that were just electrifying. And you were probably on stage for some of them. Statistically, it's very likely.
Not sure about the audience, but yes.
But do you know what I mean? There's just it's in the room, transcendent, isn't it? Can you think of an example of that?
I think I can think of lots. I mean, the time when I was at the National doing a show, I remember it had never happened to me before actually, but I got emotional at all the spots I was supposed to get emotional. So there was a real sense of being taken over by the character and feeling the sadness that he would have felt and expressing that appropriately, and sensing from the audience that there was a sense of heart coming out towards you. As you do. And yes, as you say, you can only get that if you're in the room. It is something magical, and in itself is a sort of an apologetic, isn't it? You know, well, this makes no sense if we're just a bunch of atoms bumping around in the room. But the fact that we feel these things says something very significant about the nature of the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think jazz does that in a way that a lot of art forms, other musical forms, don't allow you to do it, because you do have that freedom to really express yourself. But equally, a beautiful piece of romantic music, if you're playing it, you can get caught away in the moment as you're playing it. I'm sure it could draw you to tears, and it certainly can the audience. I mean, it's interesting just thinking about somebody who's a preacher, and I preach regularly on a Sunday. I often find myself when I'm stood up there and I'm preaching the gospel, and I'm seeing the faces in front of me, and I'm seeing people acknowledge it in front of me, and I'm not prepared for it, but the gospel hits me personally again, and it affects me emotionally as I see them. I'm not always a baller in the pulpit, but every now and again, I do well up. I can't help myself. It's I'm seeing the story of the gospel impacting people's lives in front of me, and I'm being reminded again of the work of Christ in me.
That's right.
I've had that
wonderful
in the last couple of years.
Sorry, go on, James.
I was going to say, I've had that exact experience in the last few years. I think it's also having kids that turned you into a bit more of a crybaby. I don't know, is that fair, Barry? You've had kids more recently than me, as it were. Definitely. Have you noticed a bit of a change?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm away from home right now, and I've only got to walk down the street and see a little sort of 3-year-old toddling along with her mittens hanging out the bottom of her anorak, and that's it, I'm gone.
And Barry bursts into tears, and the poor 3-year-old's looking at him just like, right. Well, this is embarrassing. It's normally me, the one that bursts into tears.
That's right, we need a restraining order over here. So there is that. I think the other thing, just talking about the preaching thing, and I guess this ties in with the music as well, is that there is a wonderful sense, I think, when in those moments when you're preaching, you're right, it's absolutely that dimension of seeing people respond to the beauty of the gospel. But there's also that inner sense, isn't there, that you've sort of found the groove that you're meant to be in. You're feeling God's pleasure as you do this thing that you were created to do. And I suppose that must be similar to what artists feel, jazz musicians feel when things align.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as an ensemble, it's interesting, I guess. This would relate to the church as well, but as a group, you also, in jazz, you feel more connected than you do in a lot of other art forms, because the whole time you're communicating, the fact that you don't know whose solo's next, or where's this improvisation going to go, the whole time you're connected, you're communicating, and I love that about jazz. It's such a sort of organic thing, but also you work together as a band in a way that you wouldn't in necessarily in other groups. And I guess that relates to the church, doesn't it, where we're supposed to be relational, and jazz really does bring that out.
Just talking about order again, I can't remember, just talking about playing a part at the National or whatever it is. What's interesting to me actually is how unimportant surprise is. We don't need to be surprised by a story to find it enthralling, and the reason is any provincial theatre is doing the same 15 plays over and over and over again, because that's what people want to see. And the same, if you're into jazz, the real book. And there are 200 jazz standards. There's no surprise there. So you are bringing, improvisation. There is that mix of surprise and order. But there's just something about seeing actors bring your story to life. Like it's Macbeth. Yeah, we know the story of Macbeth. And yet when it's done there in the room, there's a guy. He is Macbeth. And then when he said, my favourite words from Macbeth, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this pretty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. It's stunning and beautiful, but they're not surprising because I know them, as in I'm familiar with them. I've just read them off a screen. I haven't memorised them. But when you hear those words said by that person in this context, in this situation, it just really it really comes alive, doesn't it? And I think maybe we're so good at recording stuff now. We now have lossless. I think is it Get Back or something? A new album, Beatles album, has just been released, re-released, lossless. You just think, yeah, but imagine being there. And that's what I've just been watching Get Back, and
Incredible.
Slightly puzzled by it in some ways. But you just think, just being in the room with those guys as they were just sort of noodling around with a...
Well, that was it, wasn't it? That was what I think made the documentary so popular, was that video of Paul McCartney just sat there in the studio with Ringo and George sat in front of him, and he's like, I've got this little idea, and he just starts playing it, and then by the end of the session they're all there and they've got this tune, and it's just watching that process is like being in the room, and it's phenomenal.
So I just think that order thing is really important, which is why we just tell the same stories, and again in the Bible we see the same stories just coming back again and again.
And yet it's a sort of open-ended order, isn't it? I think that's what really captures people. Because like with Macbeth, yes, of course, for the most part it's the same words. We know the plot, what the plot's going to be, etc., etc. But there's something about, as you say, the dynamics of the room, the particular actors, but also the particular sense that those particular actors give to those particular words that remakes it in the presence of the people sitting there. And there's enough breathing room. This is the genius of Shakespeare, isn't it? That there's such a lot of breathing room in the text that it can be endlessly reinterpreted across centuries and make people think, it's as if this has been written yesterday. And I suppose jazz has a similar kind of quality, unlike a lot of very disposable, trashy music, which I won't name. There's a sort of there's a locked down quality about that doesn't give you any room. There's no room for the imagination. Whereas with jazz and with the best writing and with the best painting, it leaves room for the viewer to sort of interpolate themselves and actually enter into it. That's sort of the beauty of it, isn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely. And then obviously off the back of jazz, there is the dance and the congregation right from the very early days of jazz were involved in, as I call it, congregation, the audience were involved in the performance and the dancing that would come off of that as well. Lots of different dances came out of jazz music, and because they were so engaged with the performance, so a part of it, that it just flowed naturally from it.
Yeah. I think this helps us understand eternity as well. I think we particularly now have a real problem understanding and being excited about being with God forever and the new heavens and the new earth, because there's an element of what are we going to do?
Yeah, then what
because everything's done, isn't it? It's like no, and so you get a taste of it in The Last Battle, the further up and further in. Which is still quite nebulous, actually. I've never found that quite as helpful as other people seem to find it. But it resonates with me, but it doesn't explain everything. But I think this idea that you can just tell the same story again and again in a different way, and how we tell that story in 30 years' time will feel different from how we told it 30 years ago. And if we keep doing that forever, it's going to feel different forever. And we're going to go from glory to glory, because also we're getting better at stuff. One of the weird things
that's true about a finite creation.
Yeah.
So if you then transpose that to a situation where you're reacting to an infinite, non-created being, you need eternity by definition.
Yeah.
Right.
We live in a golden age of scripted television. I keep being told. Says the script writer, who doesn't seem to be catching much of that, much of the gold. But it's being sort of apparently hosed around at writers generally. But what's weird is people are almost angry that there's so much decent television to watch, and they're falling behind and say, oh my goodness, there's so much to watch, and they feel hopeless and cross. And one of the things that I would want to say is, it feels to me like we're getting better at television. That's good, isn't it? And but nobody seems to be terribly happy about it, because they would like to contain the amount of stuff so that they get to sort of master all of it and be in the know on the next big thing. But we do get better at things, including the arts. I mean, look back 1,000 years and how church singing was. There was this amazing revolution when they said, how about if we had a harmony? How about if there was some other dude singing underneath in a way that sounded like it was like related to the tune? And people just blew their minds, and then they tried it with 3 and then 4. But these things happened really slowly, didn't they? I mean, really slowly. I'm reading a lot about the medieval church at the moment, and just the pace of change was incredibly slow. And then you're born into this, you're born into the late 20th, early 21st century. And suddenly there's a whole load of stuff that's just a given, because we are fulfilling the mandate. I think sometimes, again, I keep returning to this theme. Sorry, Barry. But we keep thinking that we're not getting anywhere, and that we're not making disciples of all nations, and that we're not fulfilling the creation mandate. And we are. Because it's I'm going to quote the year literally as an argument. It's 2022, for goodness sake. So we literally are. I'm thrilled that I've been able to quote the year genuinely as an argument.
I was convinced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is. That's how it works. And I think jazz really shows that in quite a pure form, in my view.
I don't know. Like, I'm going to just slightly push back on that and say,
please do.
I think that whilst we can certainly say we've got technically better about creating TV. 4K is probably better than watching 576 lines of resolution or whatever. There's certainly an argument that we're less good at doing things like the average plot that you see on Netflix, or the average. There's. If you're asking the question about what the art is achieving, isn't there a sort of a point at which there's a sort of possible regression? The second law of thermodynamics of, drama and sitcom kicks in, and you start, maybe not being quite so developed or as successful artistically as you were 20, 30 years ago. I don't know.
I think you're talking about moral degeneracy and the fact that our stories are becoming degenerate.
I guess I am.
I would partially agree, but firstly, we can just tell stories differently, so that quite often the dark part of the story is darker than we're used to, and therefore it looks really godless. But there aren't that many that hold their nerve and stay there. Most of them have to have, even Breaking Bad, I believe, has to have some kind of, I've not seen it, but Game of Thrones would be one, where the kind of like the very ending of Game of Thrones is like, it was infuriating to people, because it was really mainstream. It was really like, oh, okay, kind of all turned out all right then. I don't know. What do you reckon, John?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, in a way, I can see what Barry's saying. So with jazz, when was the last time jazz really evolved any further than where it's become? I mean, you could say jazz fed contemporary music. Contemporary music is the result of jazz, and for that we can blame jazz. But I think that most contemporary jazz these days isn't really progressing it in any way. I might get shot down by that, and I've got lots of friends who are jazz musicians and are playing their trade in it. But I don't think it has evolved any further. It certainly has fed and inspired other art forms, other musical forms. But in a sense, it kind of had its day in a way.
Yeah. I think there's that's a really good point, and I think I'm going to slightly agree with Barry as well, unfortunately. When it comes to situation comedy, which is my thing, which is essentially you've got 24, 28, 22 minutes to start a story, tell the middle, and then resolve it. I think situation comedies are harder to write and watch and produce now, because we live in a world that is fundamentally, the West is nihilistic. And so the sitcom seems more trite and unrealistic than ever, because people just go, yeah, but life's not like that. I mean, in actual fact, life is like that. But the neatness of it seems twee and simple and actually Christian. They are intensely moral situation comedies. So as we do move away from a consensus that lying is bad And if you tell a lie in a sitcom, you're going to be exposed, and you're going to say sorry, and you're going to do some damage, and you're going to learn your lesson until this time next week. So I think there's an extent to which, when we cut ourselves away from our Christian foundations, we shouldn't be surprised when art degenerates in that sense. But I think it's not quite as simple as that. There is a technical ability, which I think is interesting, and I don't know.
Well, Ricky Gervais is interesting, wasn't he? Because after 2 series of The Office, he was pushed to do more, but he was quite bold in saying, "No, that's enough. That's done. That's done its day." And in lots of ways, you look back and think, "Wow, that was bold," but it was brilliant because it really was.
Although.
Oh, yeah, well, the American Office.
No, but also,
is that what you can say? Oh no,
which ran for 180 episodes. And also, he then did a movie based on it. In a way, there is a sense of just sort of wrapping things up and moving on. I always advise writers never to do that, because to get a sitcom on is so hard, and for it to be actually good is so hard. There is absolutely no certainty that you're ever going to manage it again.
Sure.
Because it's total lightning in a bottle, planets aligning stuff. So walk away.
Take every series
at your peril. That's why Scrubs actually also went on a year longer than and the writer openly said, if I decided to stop when I wanted, a whole load of people were basically not going to get paid for a year. And I didn't feel I could do that. I think they'd have found other jobs. But anyway, he seemed to think that he was doing it for everybody else. But yeah, I don't know. Well, to be honest, I think we've done pretty well here. I think we've started with jazz and gone on some strange improvisation around some common themes. Wow, life and art imitating each other in some way.
Jonathan, it was really good to talk to you. If people wanted to get in touch with you or have the Roots of Jazz event at their venue, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, well, it's we book up. We're pretty busy, but we love doing the event. So we're the rootsofjazz.org is our website, and you can email at therootsofjazzevent.org.uk, I think, but the website, the email address is on the website. I've handed that over to somebody else now who organises it. He books all the events. We've got a few coming up, but I think we've got 4 of them in March, a couple in April. So there may be one near you.
Where is that on the website? Where they are?
It's on the website, yeah. If you go to up and coming events, there's a little tab there, and you can see where they are.
Okay.
And with Passion for Life events coming up all over UK, we are getting booked up fast. So yeah.
Cool. Speaking of which, and the reason this conversation is partly happening is, I'm doing a gig at John's church called Water into Wine, and that is also, and so that's kind of a comedy improvised. It's not improvised. It's another slightly surprising evangelistic event that people seem to be liking. So
we're looking forward to it.
Yeah. No, it should be fun. Great. Thanks very much, John. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. You can email us cooperandcary@gmail.com. We continue to persevere with Facebook to little avail, I think. We're slightly more active on Twitter, Cooper and Cary, on the tweets, and also on Instagram. Isn't that right, Barry? We're still Instaring, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Come and look at our pictures of books and things like that. It's really exciting. It's good.
Oh no, and occasional sound bites and things like that.
Yeah, that's true.
Cool. Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks, John, for being with us.
Pleasure.
And we'll speak to you next time. Cheerio.
Bye.
We'll just hang on for a little bit because our Patreons are still with us.
Yeah.
Is there anything we didn't talk
really
about?
Controversial stuff, John. So,
is there anything that this is what they say at the end of the extra bit on In Our Time? Do you ever listen to that? Where Melvin Bragg always says, "What didn't we talk about that we should have talked about?"
Well, there was a very controversial phrase that I held back from saying because I didn't want it to be in. But jazz is often talked about as musical masturbation.
Okay.
Because you're basically it's also about showing off, what you can do technically. But yeah, so I held back from saying that. You'll probably be pleased to know.
Yeah, but it's a helpful term because we sort of know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, I'm gonna defend jazz again as well, without defending masturbation. But clearly there is an element. The expression you might use is self-pleasure. What could be wrong with the pure enjoyment of the miracle of music, and how this incredible, the more you dig, the more you dig. I mean, there is a link between mathematics and music as well, isn't there? And there's quite a lot of musicians are skilled mathematicians, or vice versa. I don't know how that might be overplayed. It's like people say, oh, lots of comedians are depressed as well, aren't they? And it's like, I don't think it's any more than average, but sure. But it just feels like the further we dig into the source code of the universe that God has made, the more we go, holy moly, this is good. There's some fractals down here. This chord goes with that. This works with that. If you keep going along here, if musically you go out of that door in 15 minutes time, you're going to come back through here. It is magical, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was saying in the idea that often the musicians are enjoying it more than the audience, and I think that's in a way it's a really good thing, because actually then the audience do enjoy it more. If you've had a sort of a fairly flat show, if you haven't really enjoyed it, and then the audience haven't really riffed off that, and I think it's important, and it also it's a gift. It's a beautiful thing that God has given us. Music is central in the Bible, isn't it? That praise and jazz was rooted in that. That's where it came from. That's what it came out of. That's why I love it all the more now, because I've seen that link. I've made that link, and when we do the roots of jazz, there's this moment in the show where I've just explained the gospel, and then we play Amazing Grace. And the saxophonist solo, particularly when it's Andre, as I've said before, who is a born again Christian who loves Jesus, you just see that coming out in the solo. And again, I'm drumming, I'm playing along, but I'm often close to tears there, because you can hear it, and that is the piece that just gets the biggest reaction from the crowd. And I think it's partly because it's well known, but partly because it's the way it's played and the joy with which it's played and what it is expressing.
Barry, have you done improv?
Comedy?
Yeah. How's that?
How is it?
Yeah. I'd imagine you found it utterly terrifying.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that there's an element of improv in the best comedy and the best acting anyway. But I suspect you're talking about like Whose Line Is It Anyway type stuff. But again, even there,
Second City.
You and I both know that a lot of that is a lot less improvised than it seems. It's basically just an assemblage of previously rehearsed bits.
Or just bits that have been improvised before and worked, and that's just been crowbarred in.
But I think that's why I loved acting and loved comedy so much, were those moments where you're on stage and you lock eyes with the person you're doing it with, and you see there's a twinkle there. There's like, okay, I'm doing something slightly different, and that knocks you slightly off kilter, and then you enjoy trying to find your feet, and it brings new things out of you. I love that. Yeah, I really, really enjoy that. And I imagine that if you're the sort of actor that's terrified of that, or the sort of comedian that's terrified of that, you end up being like, one of those bands who are doomed forever to play their sort of number one hit again and again and again, and they're in their 60s and they just hate each other and they hate the song because it's, they're forced to do it and play it in a particular way. And I think the best musicians, like Radiohead playing Creep, which they've now started to do again, is because they are essentially jazz musicians. They know that you can find new stuff in it if you're skilled enough. And that's where the joy is. You're not bound to something that you recorded 30 years ago to exactly reproduce every single vocal inflection and so on.
It reminds me of poor old Chesney Hawkes coming to Southampton to do a set of new material with a crowd of students.
Play the one and
all the way through poor guy, desperately trying to play his new stuff. After every song, no applause. Play the one and only, all the way through. Poor guy. And he finished his set, walked off, and everyone shouted, play the one and only. And he did. He
knows he's got
guy.
to. He's not.
He's got to. But
do you know the weird thing about you saying
poor
that,
guy.
Jonathan, is I actually, a friend of mine, Matt Tor, managed him when I was studying at Oxford, and so we all trooped down dutifully to see him when he played the Oxford Playhouse. And as I remember it, he played the song at least twice. So because at the time that was sort of the only song he had, really. So yes, he played it, and then as an encore. So yeah.
But again, I mean, the importance of being a Christian in that situation. If I'm recording some podcasts for the Keswick Convention, and the theme of them is being grateful. And actually, what's really lovely when you see someone who has had one hit, they're grateful for it rather than resentful of it, is you would hope that Chesney Hawkes would have the grace to be able to say, the only reason this many people come to see me do my new material is because I had that one hit. Mm-hmm. So rather than be angry that he didn't have more hits, or that they've come without that expectation, just to be able to give. And it's really sweet when you do meet people, and working with a radio producer, there are one or two actors who have a bit of a shtick. And I remember this producer just said, oh yeah, he's great. He knows why he's been booked. So, when they're booked to play a part, they know the part that, you don't really need to say, oh, could you do it like you always do it? And everyone knows that you do it, because you're terrified they're going to go, I really don't want to be typecast, love. I have range, He says, no. They know.
Would you not want to be typecast? It's actually fantastically good for you in terms of your earning ability and so on. I mean, it's like...
It is, but if you're all about the art and you're quite a bitter and resentful person, then that is eventually going to crush you.
Like Alec Guinness, who always used to swear at small children when they'd come up to him and ask him if they, Obi-Wan Kenobi would sign a thing for them. Just hated it.
Yeah. No, definitely. Hey, I see you're on in Bath very soon. I might try and come to that one.
I'm not at that one.
Okay.
But enjoy nonetheless.
Bath. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, so we've no, we haven't done there before. Have we done? Oh, we did a church around the corner there before. Yeah. No, I'm stepping back from it a bit just because
life
the senior pastor and
the
band are continuing. Phil, the bass player, actually he was at All Souls. You might know him, Barry. Phil Wayne played bass.
Okay.
Anyway, he's kind of leading the group now, and I'm doing maybe one a month because I love doing it.
You got a pretty heavy March, April coming up.
Well, it might be worth saying. So Grace Church Bath, Stevenage, Longmeadow, Dundonald Church London, Eden Church Cambridge, Grace Church Leatherhead, King's Church Chesington, Arbroath and Barkham churches, Christchurch Mayfair and Grace Church Wanstead. So if you happen to be near any of those places over the next couple of months,
I have attended. I've been a member of two of those churches, Dundonald Church and Christchurch Mayfair. That's should be fun. The thing I didn't say, that I said I might say, is obviously Christian events want background jazz because it's not saying anything.
Okay, yeah.
It's background. And it sounds plinky plonky and it sounds cultured, but without actually in the minds of the people who booked it having any and in some senses they're doing everything they can to stop it from having any impact because it's literally background. And so that's a difference between design, which is literally background, and art, which is a thing in itself, isn't it? Wallpaper isn't art, it's design, isn't it? You're not meant to stand and stare at wallpaper every time you walk into a room.
Yeah. And just thinking, we're just talking about the one-hit wonders who get frustrated, but it's similar, I think, for jazz musicians who spend most of their lives maybe playing for afternoon teas in central London posh hotels, playing those jazz standards over and over again, and then desperately trying to get a gig of their original material in the Jazz Club or Pizza Express, but they do it because that's the money earner. That's what people want.
Yeah, and that's where we need to have contentment, isn't it? And that's where we need to, because also all of those boring gigs, as it were, you are really learning your craft. And frankly, if you're making a living as a professional musician, you're already winning. You know what I mean? This is not something that many people. I certainly feel that with my writing career, is I've gotten away with it so far, and that's no small thing. So you know, just count your blessings.
And I love seeing people enjoying it when they're doing that. So our pianist Jay Fascioli Luke, who's just loves playing the piano, and if he walks past a piano, you know, King's Cross Station or in a restaurant or whatever, he's on it and he'll play for whoever will listen, and he's just passionate about it. So he's, you know, I love watching someone like that just genuinely love playing, and they'll play any gig, anytime, for any fee. And they get abused for it.
Well, you're the senior pastor of a church, so you should probably get back to that. Yeah, I should probably go and write some jokes. Barry, what you do is up to you.
Thank you.
You need to go out and not cry in front of some 3-year-old children.
Yeah, I've got one more question actually that just occurred to me as you were saying.
Oh, go for it.
Do you think that your being a musician, particularly a jazz musician, has changed the way that you preach?
Wow, that's an interesting question that I've not considered. I guess in some of the stuff we've talked about, in that sort of storytelling, engaging with those in front of you, I've probably subconsciously thought about it, and maybe more consciously thought about it at times. The flow of the sermon, in the same way that you might think about the flow of a improvisation, in order to impact and tell that story better.
Are you a full manuscript guy, or are you much more improvisational in the moment?
Fascinating. No, I'm a full manuscript guy, because I have less confidence in my preaching ability than I do in my drumming. Yeah.
That's cool.
I'm a full manuscript guy as well, because I'm worried about. I'm not worried I'm going to dry up. I'm worried that I'll get sidetracked, or that I will be distracting because I'll basically be funny, or say something that's interesting but not helpful,
or heretical. Whereas in a drum solo, there's very little heresy, and as in that 10-minute Phil Collins drum solo, you will ramble.
That's right. Oh, that's really interesting. It's been really good to talk with Jonathan. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great.
It's been great fun.
I'm looking forward to meeting you when the time comes. And thanks very much, Patreons. We hope you've enjoyed that little extra bit there. And we will be back next time with Brant Hansen, won't we, Barry?
That is right. We're going to be talking to him about all things manly. The Men That We Need is his new book that's coming out. So if you have got questions you would like us to ask him, then jump on the Discord server and let us know. We'd love to put them to him. Yeah,
cool. And we'll try and find some breaking animal news as well to break in with.
That's
right. Sorry, I'm still obsessed with that. Anyway, thanks very much, everybody. Cheerio.
Bye.
Sugar and tea have words.